Good afternoon, everyone, and please welcome to our Planning Skills webinar on community wealth building and its integration with planning. I'm joined today by Miriam McKenna from the Improvement Service. She is the Programme Manager for Inequality, Economy and Climate Change and deals regularly with community wealth building projects, and by Alistair Gemmell, the Strategic Planning Manager at North Ayrshire Council. Who's looking to integrate community wealth building into their planning policy.
What I'm going to do is just quickly take us through a kind of fairly brief overview of what community planning is and some of the key components of community planning, community wealth building. You can tell I was doing community planning in a past life. Community wealth building and just some of the key components of that, some of the challenges that we might experience in trying to deliver it, and some of the examples of where it's already happening in Scotland, but Alistair will give you much more detail about that in terms of what's happening in North Ayrshire. But first of all, we thought it would be good to show you a short, very basic video from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, who've been leading on community wealth building in the UK, just to give you a general overview of what it is and what it's all about. Community wealth building makes wealth socially helpful by ensuring it's broadly held, owned and distributed. So the idea being that you don't have extractive economies like your Amazons and your other big companies basically taking the money and offshoring it, taking it somewhere else, so then there's no benefit locally. So it focuses on delivering a local well-being economy. So we talk a lot about inclusive growth, and well-being economies is the sort of step on from that, Scotland's taking a perspective on that. New Zealand and Iceland working all together to make sure that everyone benefits from a local economy rather than just the rich few at the top. So it focuses on productivity benefits, so that's contributing to national prosperity. Social benefits are bringing economic activity where it can produce the highest social return, and then environmental benefits, so it's shortening supply chains, and that's something we've seen with COVID and the beginning of COVID in terms of supply chains. When everything was locked down, actually it was much more beneficial to have a shorter local supply chain, and that keeps the money and wealth in the local area as well. And it can be regional, because accepting that some local authorities are very small and wouldn't necessarily have all the businesses that they would potentially procure from. So it's a whole systems approach to economic development geared to challenging things like austerity and automation of services as well, where maybe jobs are getting lost, but how do we kind of create the environment to have wealth in a local community that stays in that local community. So you may have heard the sort of reference to anchor institutions, and these are the kind of large commercial, public, social sector organisations that have an important presence in a place. So usually by virtue of being large-scale employers or the largest purchasers of goods and services in a locality, and they oversee large areas of land and have relatively fixed assets. So they're quite wealthy in themselves in terms of what they own and their stake in that local place. So examples would include things like local authorities, NHS trusts and boards, universities, large local businesses, housing associations and so on, and also the combined activities of community and voluntary sector organisations too. So once an anchor institution or anchor institutions come together and identify a desire to improve community wealth, then they can, in partnership, try and build that around these key 5 pillars, and you can review yourself against these and then identify and prioritise local action, and I know that's what North Ayrshire have done. So some areas focus on developing 1 or 2 pillars of these 5 pillars here, and then others might try and deliver action under all 5, but it's for the local anchors to agree what local action they will undertake. And some pillars have ideas within them that will be familiar to you, and local authorities may already be delivering related actions. So just go into these in a wee bit more detail. So in terms of ownership, the focus is on the plural ownership of economy. So it's not just all being held by one organisation or one agency. So it's about promoting locally owned and socially minded enterprises and democratisation of the economy. So so local or socially minded enterprises are more likely to employ, buy and invest locally, thereby contributing to local economic and social development. In these instances, therefore, there's a higher propensity for wealth to be generative and create more wealth locally than extracted and taken out of the economy into the pockets of big business. Some examples of the plural ownership of the economy are things like public sector insourcing. There was a lot of public sector outsourcing for a while there, often going to large companies, not large multinationals. But bringing things back into the centre helps to recalibrate local services to local needs, so keeping that connection again. Municipal enterprises, for example, things like renewable energy schemes run by local authorities, which can generate surplus income and go straight back into the economy. Worker ownership, so things like local cooperatives, social enterprises, and community ownership, so community land trusts, community interest companies, and so where you're focusing on the ownership or lease of local assets for community benefit, and that ties into the Community Empowerment Act in Scotland. Local investment is about making financial power work for local places. So the banking sector is oriented towards global markets rather than local investment and economic development. So there used to be municipal banks, and I know there's been credit unions and things like that in local areas. So these are the kind of things where you're keeping personal banking services small and local that can invest in the local community as well. And again, not extracting. So some areas, in, for example, Preston, I think have been trying to set up a municipal bank, and the Scottish National Investment Bank might be something that could help support some of that, albeit it's on a national basis. But for Scotland, to make it work properly, you probably are looking at that scale anyway if you were going to do some form of municipal bank. So other ways you can make financial power work for local places is looking at things like local pension funds to support local investment priorities. So instead of, and there's a big call for disinvestment in carbon producing things as well. So, it ties into climate change, but maybe, Preston City Council, for example, have invested some of its public pension fund into local housing development in the city centre. They get a return on that for the pension, but they're also supporting the community. And you can support local credit unions and provision of loans to community groups as well, as I mentioned earlier. Fair employment and just labour markets, very focused on making sure that businesses pay the real living wage, that you have succession and progression planning in place. Ties into things like Fair Work Scotland and No One Left Behind and the just transition to the green economy, making sure that as you're moving sectors to different renewable sectors, that people aren't going to be out of work. So it's the kind of the anchors being the biggest employers in a place can have a defining effect on the prospects of income and incomes of local people through their employment practices. You can maybe make sure that you're employing from your areas of multiple deprivation and giving people opportunities to be able to access those jobs and things. So, for example, the real living wage or some of the inclusive employment programmes that we can get. And I mentioned No One Left Behind. So, and also you've got things like modern apprenticeships that could be targeted for local areas and for people who you want to get into to work in the council as an employer as well as a procurer. And procurement of goods and services is really important because community wealth building promotes the sort of progressive procurement of goods and services. So it's about trying to create those local dense supply chains and ecosystems of local enterprises, small to medium enterprises, employee-owned businesses, social enterprises, cooperatives and other forms of community ownership. So you're making that connection to the plural ownership of the economy by being a big anchor organisation and buying from them to support them and make sure that it's happening. So as I said, during the pandemic, the shorter supply chains worked better than the longer ones when things shut down, we couldn't import things. And now EU exit obviously has extended, where the extended supply chains are causing difficulties as well. And we've seen that already in terms of types of medicines not being available as readily as they used to be. So, for example, I think I've sort of been given examples there in terms of local spending and social value frameworks, but making sure that you buy locally. Manchester City Council have got a social value framework where they consistently use 20% social value weighting in their tendering processes. So, that's built in there at the centre of it. So it's about, being able to access that local supply chain, but also then supporting employment in the local area. And assets, so socially productive use of land and property. The goal here is not simply for a local authority to anchor institution to own more land, but instead to ensure that the land they do own is run by and for the people. And this can be understood through the concept of like common good in Scotland. And the idea that the land held by public institutions is owned by all of us together. So to achieve this, public landowners can develop governance and management structures where communities can take direct control of common assets. So you've got your community asset transfer in Community Empowerment Act, where the encouragement is for local communities to take on assets that perhaps they're not being used by the anchor institutions. So they can either potentially rent these or lease them or buy them depending on the community. But it's very important to make sure that it's not just those affluent communities where people are quite capable of taking on assets and feeling quite confident are the only ones that are doing it. It's about making sure that that's not perpetuating inequalities, that in local areas, local people in perhaps multiple deprived areas have access to that kind of opportunity as well, and the support to be able to do it. So as I mentioned, community asset transfers, we've got that in Scotland already, happening in various places, and it's pushed along by the Community Empowerment Act. But you can also use land to support a local community, for example, letting local community groups and charities to use buildings, facilities, land for their conferences, for events and things like that, without having to pay a large fee for it, but making sure that that sort of common good land is shared equitably. So some of the challenges in terms of delivering something like community wealth building is the continued dominance of our current economic model. It's about focusing on GDP and after the fact economic development centred around the fruits of growth, so that and that can be quite extractive as well. So it's about having more money coming in with not thinking about what's happening to local people. And that's definitely something that's come through from the pandemic as well, in terms of that economic model isn't supporting everyone. It's not a rising tide floats all boats when a lot of people are already anchored to the bottom and they can't then overcome that, and they're drowning when they can't access the economy and are living in poverty or on the edge of it. Policy obstacles are probably there in terms of some of the commercialisation across local government, like we said earlier, in terms of outsourcing, but maybe trying to make sure that stays in. A lot of commissioning has been reduced to competitive tendering with a focus on value for money and driving down costs. But where can you bring that social value in, like Manchester City are doing for things like a lot of the commissioning that happens perhaps in health and social care partnerships, but certainly for other local government services too. So trying to make sure that that's a local approach rather than outsourcing to big business and taking that out of the economy. And there's a lack of strong drivers to encourage community wealth building, but I think Scotland's actually much further ahead than England on this. England has the Social Value Act 2012. We've got procurement legislation that's looking at sustainability, looking at community benefit clauses, although they're not used as well as they could be. But certainly, Scotland's probably a wee bit further ahead than England in terms of how it seeks to create social value and things like community wealth building. And it's not something that we've never done before. It's about how we bring together everything that we're already doing under the umbrella and the organisation of something like community wealth building to make sure that it gets the best results for your local communities. And it's already happening in Scotland. So obviously you'll hear from Alistair about North Ayrshire, but councils and employers contribute to fair employment and just labour markets because we're the major employers in a lot of areas. So we employ 10% of the resident employment base in a third of councils. So they're a big anchor institution, and the health boards are massive employers as well. So between the two in a local area, they can have quite a considerable impact on fair employment and just labour. Councils as procurers contribute to the progressive procurement of goods and services. I mentioned the Procurement Reform Act creates opportunities to develop progressive procurement, and there's a lot of things that we're doing that could be targeted towards local areas even more than are currently. And then councils are asset managers. There's something like 40,000 assets owned by Scottish local authorities. And that's a huge range of different things: land, buildings, infrastructure. And there's a general direction of travel towards a corporate asset management approach linked to social and economic outcomes at all levels, from strategic to local. So that ties into the community asset transfer, but also how we use our businesses and support local town centres. For example, if a council HQ was suddenly to be moved to the outskirts of the town, would that mean that a lot of local businesses wouldn't get enough money to keep running with all the staff who would maybe come out for lunch and things like that? So other councils and city deals that are looking at community wealth building approaches include Tay Cities, so that'll be an interesting one to see. So they're being supported by Scottish Government and CLES, who did the video earlier, and who a lot of this presentation material is based on. So North Ayrshire, the trailblazers in Scotland, but CLES and Scottish Government are working with these areas to pilot different approaches to community wealth building. So these cities will be interesting because that's the first growth deal. They're sort of looking at Western Isles as a very distinct economy. Clackmannanshire is looking at well-being economy approaches, so community wealth building being one part of the delivery of that. And one of Glasgow City Regional Authorities is the plan to work with, as well as the South of Scotland Enterprise, which has just recently been set up to work with Dumfries and Galloway and Scottish Borders around enterprise. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops as well, because that's a new area and could be informed by community wealth building from the start. And there's further opportunities that can be taken in terms of positive targeting of recruitment. You've got work experience, I mentioned apprenticeships. You can target this into disadvantaged areas and different groups through local government and community planning partners coming all together as the anchor institutions to try and make sure that you employ locally as much as possible and get everybody into the opportunities, but think about succession planning as well and moving up the career ladder rather than just, perhaps focusing on the lower end of the job scale. Whilst there's little growth in demand in local government employment in terms of new jobs, there is an up and coming replacement demand because there is an ageing workforce in local government. So future workforce planning can provide an opportunity for tackling poverty, for recruiting from disadvantaged areas again. Looking at better economic development and procurement collaboration, but also planning comes into that as well in terms of how the three services look to deliver in a local area. How does the local development plan drive some of that, asset management? How does it provide opportunities for employment, for businesses coming in, for local businesses to start up? Where have you got your startup hubs and things like that, and how you plan for that? You can look more strategically, collaboratively, aspirationally, and be more imaginative about community benefits. A lot of the time it's a kind of tick the box, here's some apprenticeships on construction and that'll do. But actually, there are restrictions to it, but how do you make that much more beneficial for a local area and for people? And then targeted local procurement, as I mentioned before, alongside supplier development programmes, making sure you make those connections. And then data improvements to measure local procurement as well. So Preston are able to show what they've managed to generate for their local economy. So how do you measure that as well going forward to make sure you know what impact you've had on that local area by perhaps not buying from further afield? I'll not go into all of these. There's asset management for developing the place agenda, there's opportunities to evolve your asset portfolio, and community asset transfers I've spoken about before can be really used to promote community ownership. So, can cooperatives or social enterprises take on assets and further community wealth building? And you've got to make sure that we're working across all the different departments to make sure that they're maximising the opportunities. So I'll stop there. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to answer them just now, or we can wait till the end. And thanks for listening.
As Trevor said, I'm Alistair Gemmell, Strategic Planning Manager at North Ayrshire Council. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and the timeline for community wealth building in North Ayrshire, but as Scotland's sort of first community wealth building council, how we in planning incorporate community wealth building into what we do and into our policies is something that we've been sort of thinking about for probably the last 12 months or more. So I hope to share some of that thinking with you over the next 20 minutes or so. A caveat before I go too much further, these are just some thoughts that we have had about how we can embed community wealth building principles into the next local development plan, which we will commence preparation of when MPF4 and the development planning regulations are published next year. So no definitive answers about how we align community wealth building and planning, nothing we have tested in detail, but hopefully some ideas to think about as we all navigate our way through plan preparation and the multitude of concepts and requirements we need to consider over the next 2 to 3 years in response to planning reform, the COVID pandemic, climate change, health and economic inequalities, and the need to deliver more homes. So community wealth building in North Ayrshire, we had a virtual round table last month where everyone within the council involved in delivering community wealth building, including the council leader, came together, and the purpose of that was mainly to welcome and introduce the 9 new community wealth building staff that the council has appointed over the last 10 months or so, and to kind of explain how they are helping deliver community wealth building. But Our head of service mentioned at that kind of meeting that it was the council leader sharing this article here on screen from The Guardian in 2017 that sort of kick-started and started the ball rolling on North Ayrshire looking at adopting what is an alternative approach to traditional economic development. Now, at the time, we were already involved in a joint piece of work with the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor at the Scottish Government, an inclusive growth diagnostic, which aimed at assessing what was holding back long-term sustainable inclusivity and growth in North Ayrshire. Following that, in 2019, we explored with Claire's how we could become a community wealth building council. What would that look like? We established a Community Wealth Building Commission with the purpose to drive forward progress on community wealth building across the council and with other regional anchor institutes, and adopted a new council plan that committed us not only to preparing a community wealth building strategy, but more than that, had the principles of fairness and equity at its heart, this setting the platform for everything we do at North Ayrshire Council. And moving on, last year in May, we became the first council in Scotland to publish a community wealth building strategy. So Miriam has provided a comprehensive overview of the features of community wealth building there. In a North Ayrshire context, the community wealth building strategy sets out North Ayrshire Council's ambitious plans around community wealth building. We are working in partnership with our communities and businesses to create a fair local economy, reducing poverty and inequality by applying a new economic model focused on well-being and inclusion. This approach uses the economic levers available to the council and other anchor institutions to develop resilient and inclusive local economies, create more local employment and a larger and more diverse business base, ensuring that wealth is locally owned and benefits local people. The strategy includes 55 actions and is aligned to the 5 community wealth building pillars that Miriam highlighted before. And just some of the ways that we are delivering community wealth building include through engagement across all services and wider local and regional partners with communities and local businesses, through the 9 new community wealth building roles that I mentioned, which are across a number of services within the council, including employability and business support, regeneration and connected communities. Through the community wealth building expert panel, we've put together a team of leading economic experts to assist us with our ambitious plans, acting as a critical friend and sounding board, and the panel will help us review our strategy as it moves forward. Also, the £3 million from the Ayrshire Growth Deal project. This money in this project will develop a regional approach to working with anchor institutions to facilitate place-based community wealth building activities on procurement, employment, assets and ownership within localities, promote fair work practices across Ayrshire, and support and fund community wealth building activity, including social enterprises, employee ownership, and cooperative development and supplier development activities. And this is in addition to money from the council's own budget, an £8.8 million investment fund, and our economic recovery and renewal approach that's been developed following COVID. So what we're here to speak about, though, is not just community wealth building, it's community wealth building and planning, and how we can link the two. So I've got the 5 pillars as we see them in North Ayrshire there, but where does planning fit in? You know, councils and anchor institutions can control what they buy, and they can control what they do with the land that they own, but what can the planning system contribute? The key tools for implementing community wealth building are procurement, fair work, investment and ownership of businesses and land and assets, as I said, and which on the face of it aren't things that we can directly affect through planning. And this is sort of, I suppose, the dilemma that we've been having, as perhaps you have. Now, on the face of it, the most obvious place to start, I guess, is the land and assets pillar. And we're planners, we deal with land, so that seems like a good start. Our community wealth building strategy highlights that anchors are often major landowners and can support equitable land development and the development of underutilised assets for community use. The strategy seeks to support the wider regeneration of our communities by maximising all of our land and assets, including through alternative uses for community and business benefit. So this is about using our land and assets for the common good. We are reviewing our land and assets transformation programme, our housing land audit, our vacant and derelict land, buildings and land and buildings, and our strategic housing investment plan through a community wealth building lens, exploring alternative community uses, commercial opportunities to grow local wealth, support town centre regeneration, and also how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in line with our carbon neutral ambitions. But into a bit more detail of our thinking around how community wealth building and planning aligns. And I think the good news is, I think community wealth building is already inherent in a lot of what we're doing. The National Planning Framework Position Statement tells us that NPF4 will be a plan for a wellbeing economy, and that policies will refocus on community wealth building and sustainability. And it acknowledges that community wealth building is being explored at a regional scale in the emerging regional spatial strategy for Ayrshire, which links with the area's growth deal and the economic strategy and promotes place-based investment. Potential policy changes include explicitly supporting development that can demonstrate its contribution to well-being and to a well-being economy and fair work. This could include, for example, the introduction of new requirements from investment to secure social and environmental value and the delivery of our public health priorities. There's also a clear alignment with 20-minute neighbourhoods in our approach to town centres. Supporting inclusive economies is, to me, inherent within the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. By rethinking and replanning the places we live in to ensure communities can become vibrant hubs for the people who live there to work, shop, learn, keep active and socialise, we can help create the critical mass that supports local business and employment opportunities. And I think COVID has brought the potential of this into sharp focus. From my experience, by working at home for the last year, I know I've been using the butcher and the greengrocer and the bakery in our village far more than I ever did when I was travelling the 12 miles into Irvine and working in the office every day. So without wanting to give too much away about my lunch habits, Greg's loss has been the Candy Bar Bakery in West Kilbride's gain. Me living and working and shopping more locally has helped support a local company that has 4 branches in North Ayrshire, employs around 80 people. So the wealth generated from me buying a sausage roll is now locally owned and benefits locally people. So I think that's just a good example of kind of how planning, 20-minute neighbourhoods and community wealth building all sort of comes together. And it links also to town centres, which is another important aspect. And the report recently published a new feature for Scotland's town centres, published last month, that highlights that community wealth building is one of a number of exciting opportunities to empower our communities and ensure that we maximise the impact of resources to drive better local outcomes. People and communities know their towns best, and the community wealth building approach, along with community empowerment legislation, offers exciting ways to deliver on the growing appetite for localism and the need for us to trust and strengthen the opportunities for people to have a stake in the places around them. Places where community can shape their own future, where interventions and investments support local businesses and decisions are taken for the benefit of the whole community through community wealth building, with anchor collaborations acting as local agents of change, making the collective financial power work for local places. Places that are not only successful in retaining and attracting population, but are also in attracting and retaining wealth within their communities. And I think we can probably all recognise, in the context of town centres in particular, the benefits that can arise from owning assets locally, as illustrated, for example, in the Mid-Steeple quarter in Dumfries. and a town centre first approach can support these aspirations. The second point to highlight is the potential or the role house building can have in support of community wealth building. And I'm sure as planners here, a lot of us are spend far too much time crunching numbers about house building, and obviously it can be a key focus of what we do in preparing local development plans. I think all new house building can bring benefits to local communities in terms of creating employment opportunities, supporting supply chains and subcontractors, and also in terms of increasing housing choice and maybe even an area's population. North Ayrshire, an area of low housing demand, and our current LDP in preparation of it deliberately took the approach of working closely with the house building industry to review our housing land supply with a focus on deliverability to identify additional sites that we could have a degree of certainty would come forward in the short term. And that's been relatively successful in that following adoption of the plan in November 2019. Of the 5 new sites we allocated, 1 is on site already, 2 have planning permission, and that represents approximately 700 new homes in an area where an HMD is telling us there's no demand for new housing. Now, like the difference between Greg's and the Candy Bar bakery, we recognise that community benefits may be more likely to arise where sites are developed by small and medium-sized house builders. These companies are more likely to employ local people and utilise local supply chains, and more likely to retain the wealth within the area. Our housing land supply, and I guess this might be the same for a number of authorities, includes a number of small, longer-term sites that have maybe been in the audit as non-effective for a number of years. In some respects, they kind of just get forgotten about, but in North Ayrshire, we're keen to examine what we can do to support small and medium-sized house builders to deliver some of these long-term opportunities, recognising that often these are problem sites within communities, but are not likely to be brought forward by large volume PLC builders. And there might also be scope, for example, to build into a strategy for identifying new housing sites, a sort of a greater focus on these smaller sites that would be taken forward by smaller builders, and also for self-build. That's also another element where we can sort of generate that community benefit. Third thing to highlight is local place plans. Obviously, the consultation for the regulations for local place plans is out at the moment, but I think it goes without saying that we cannot progress community wealth building without communities. Our strategy asks that our communities are at the heart of community wealth building journey and continue to work alongside us as key partners to co-create places which are resilient and successful. So I believe that local place plans could be a key mechanism to achieve this, to identify opportunities for community wealth building and projects and what have you. Then I guess the big one is the potential for a community wealth building policy. Miriam mentioned about procurement, and for large physical projects procured by the council over £4 million, community benefits are one of a range of social and environmental considerations that can be included in public contracts and frameworks. For example, the Upper Garnock Valley Flood Protection Scheme in North Ayrshire, which is under construction at the moment, is an example of where through procurement an infrastructure project is bringing community benefits in line with our community wealth building strategy. So the contractor is committed to create new employment opportunities, which has seen the creation of 5 full-time positions with 3 local residents benefiting from employment alongside a range of other benefits. But how can we derive similar community benefits, including fair work opportunities, from private sector development through the planning system? Well, there's an example of this being attempted already. Preston, one of the forerunners for a community wealth building approach in the UK, along with South Ribble and Chorley Borough Councils, adopted the Central Lancashire Employment Skills Supplementary Planning document in 2017. This SPD reflects those councils' aspirations to see additional benefits, also known as social value, incorporated into their housing and other development opportunities. One of Central Lancashire's priorities is to encourage economic growth within Central Lancashire that benefits the people and businesses of the 3 boroughs. So this PD requires developers to submit an employment and skills statement for developments of more than 30 houses or commercial floor space of over 1,000 square metres, alongside the planning application. So these statements cover things such as the creation of apprenticeships and new entrants, graduates and traineeships, around recruitment, particularly of people who are unemployed, around work trials and interview guarantees, vocational training, work experience, use of local suppliers, management and leadership training, support with transport, childcare and working equipment to allow people who maybe previously couldn't enter the job market, and also community-based projects. All sort of things that, you know, relate to community wealth building and what community wealth building are trying to achieve in terms of fair work and community benefit. So once the content of the statement has been agreed as part of the consideration of the plan application, its implementation is controlled via a planning condition or an obligation. So a real example, and I must admit I haven't followed up to find out how it's being implemented and what success it has, but you know, an example of somewhere that has really tried to kind of promote community wealth building through the planning system. And I think going further than this, you know, we'll wait and see what NPF4 says around community wealth building and what policies it has around that. But I think in North Ayrshire we would like to explore developing a social value framework, a policy and assessment tool that can form part of our next local development plan to be applied to all proposals to consider how they deliver on community wealth building. Final slide here, and to finish on this diagram, which isn't directly related to planning or community wealth building, really. It actually comes from the Strategic Transport Projects Review Update and Phase 1 Recommendations Report, which was published last month, and I'm sure you've all read in detail. I just like this diagram because I think it captures the key issues that we're looking to address through planning policy, and how really it's kind of impossible to look at anything in isolation. I think we're kind of well versed at looking at things from an environmental perspective, a social perspective, and economic perspective. But I think maybe those kind of concepts have evolved over time and are more specific now. So when we're talking about the environment, we're maybe talking more now about climate change and maybe also biodiversity. And you see the diagram there talks about taking climate action. Social, we're maybe now thinking more in terms of health and well-being. And you can see that on the diagram there. And this diagram maybe splits up, I would say, economy into thinking about reducing inequalities and also delivering inclusive economic growth. Well, for me, those two things are what community wealth building is all about. But the best thing about this diagram for me is that it places spatial planning right at the very heart of the center of that, and the center of those thoughts and how we deliver these things. And I think that's probably a positive note to end the presentation on.